It's great to see you in my first visit actually to Regent's College here, and also wonderful to talk to all the Zoom people online there. And hybrid, isn't it wonderful? We have the hybrid technology, which has really expanded our talks and our courses and our conferences all around the world. So that's really wonderful too. You know, when I'm asked to give a talk on science and miracles as a scientist, I know that a lot of people there are kind of sitting going, well, this is a scientist, you know, does he really believe in miracles? And that's kind of waiting till the end to find out, okay? So I like to start out by saying that this scientist definitely does believe in miracles, and also just to say, obviously without believing in the wonderful miracle of the resurrection from the dead of our Lord Jesus Christ, I wouldn't be here as a Christian before you, and so that is so central, isn't it, to our thinking as Christians. And also the need to share that wonderful news around the world. It was wonderful just to be chatting with your vice principal earlier this morning. As soon as he walked in the room, I looked at him and thought, I know that man, but I don't know where. And we worked out, we last met in 1980 in a truck in Ankara in Turkey. There you go. So we lived in Turkey doing church planting work with OM for many years, and other countries as well. So there we are. The OM connection is still there as well. So it's wonderful, isn't it, to join together as believers from around the world and share our common faith in the resurrected Lord Jesus Christ. Truly the miracle to start with. So I wanted to start actually with telling you a story. And it's a story about what we might call a miracle of grace, I think, which eventually had strong links with Morven for reasons I'll explain in just a moment. So I had a great grandfather called Thomas Henry Mansell, and in his teenage years he ran away to sea. And this would have been around, I suppose, the 1850s. I don't know why he ran away. He didn't like his family or something. He ran away to sea. And he ended up in Sydney, in Australia, on a ship there, which was anchored in the harbour. And he decided to go for a swim. And so he took off and he went for a swim there. And what happened was that there was a guy on the deck there who happened to be a Christian, and he was the lookout for that day, and the lookout saw my great-grandfather swimming there in the sea, and he saw a shark coming after him, and he shouted at him, "Watch out, there's a shark there." And so the story has come down from several streams in our family history that the shark came up and tried to grab his leg as he was coming up on the boat, and just missed him, and he just managed to escape from the shark. Anyway, the guy, the lookout, as I say, was a Christian. He was a member of the Plymouth Brethren. In those days, in the 1850s, it was quite a reformist, evangelical, strongly evangelical movement. Anyway, the lookout led him to Christ. And he came back to Christ, and he came to Christ, and he ended up in Birmingham, and he became an architect. And he then started a firm of architects. His two sons became an architect. And so, there we go. There's one of his sons, Thomas Gildart Mansell, who ended up building a house just down the road. Just down the road here. And we wrote to them and said, oh, we've discovered this. We have no idea who the owners were. And we're going to have tea with them. They invited us for tea this afternoon. So I'm sorry I won't be here this afternoon. Anyway, so there we are. And there's a family connection. But there's more than that too, actually. So let me see if I can get this. So a little later on then, my father, and whose mother was the person who married that, the guy who just got saved through being saved from a shark. So anyway, so she sadly lost her husband in the First World War from the Spanish flu, as it was then called. It's not really Spanish flu, wrong name, but anyway. And she lost two of her sons. My father's two brothers were lost, one in the Somme, one marching into Jerusalem and Edinburgh. Anyway, sad story. And so they were in Portsmouth, and then they had to move. Where to move to? They moved to Morven. And so she brought my father here at the age of 12, when he just lost his father and his two brothers, and they settled here in Morven, and he went to a school here, which I think no longer exists, and it's called somewhere down there, it's probably on there. He went to a school that was closed down some years ago. Anyway, so he was raised here in Morven and had that sort of connection here. So I just thought thinking about that, as I was giving this talk, I was thinking about, in a way, the kind of miracle of grace. Okay, it's a miracle of grace, you know, the shark just missing the leg of my great-grandfather there in Sydney Harbour. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here today, you know? You just think about that. And so, thanks to the Lord. Okay, now, let's just move, that's the miracle of grace. But let's now move to think about the way that the word miracles is used in daily speech. And I think that's some of a problem as we start talking about miracles, isn't it? And especially as I'm talking about miracles in the scientific community as well. Clearly, we're not going to be able to address this question properly about whether miracles and science are compatible unless we sort of, at least you know where I'm coming from, where I'm thinking about the term miracles. It was a real miracle that I got into Cambridge. You can hear that. Quite a few students will say that at Cambridge University. And I think, well, you know, Cambridge has been around for 800 years. And a lot of people have been coming to Cambridge for 800 years. So it's not really a miracle. But for you, personally, in your context, maybe it feels that way. Or we read about the miracle of the baby saved from the rubble in a terrible earthquake, and we go, wow, that's really amazing, and so on. So we got this word miracle that's used in many different ways, haven't we, in our daily speech and so forth. And if you look up Wikipedia, you can see it defines a miracle can be defined as a violation of natural law by a supernatural being. Okay, that definition is derived from the philosopher David Hume. We're going to come back to David Hume in just a moment. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of talks during the next day or so about the meaning of the miracles in theology, and I'm not a theologian, okay, but I just want to tell you where I'm coming from in this whole discussion, and particularly, I think, how the Bible uses the word miracle, which I found very influential in my own thinking, which is quite distinct from the way that David Hume used the word and understood it. And so, of course, when we come to miracles, we find many different understandings of the word miracle in the Old Testament and the New Testament, depending on the context and the words that are being used. And there are three words in particular that are used in both Hebrew and in the Greek for miracle. Just review those quickly. The Greek word teros, and its Hebrew equivalent mopeth, translated as wonders, which is what this whole conference, of course, is about. That's really used, isn't it, to draw attention to these wonders. Something very special is going on. It's a miracle that will be remembered. And so in that context, the focus is more on the amazement of the listeners or the watchers or the people who experience that particular miracle, rather than the specific purpose of what it was about. And then we have the Greek word dunamis, from which we derive, of course, our word dynamite, translated as acts of power or mighty works, emphasizing the biblical concept of miracles as a result of the operation of the dunamis, the power of the Spirit in action, the power of God, perceived particularly as the source of all power. So this is interesting, isn't it? So you've got the word teros, that sort of points more to the impact of the miracle on the observer. And then you've got dunamis, which really points to its cause. And then you've got this third really critical word of understanding how the word miracle is used in the Bible, and that's the word sign, or ot in Hebrew, or semeion in Greek, hence semiotics, of course. And that's maybe the dominant word in certain parts of the Bible. Of course, in John's Gospel, again and again, the signs and wonders, and so on, the semeion. And after crossing the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, we've got Moses who told the people that with your own eyes you saw these great trials, those miraculous signs and wonders. And as I say, of course, signs are very much used in both the Old and the New Testaments. So in terms of Peter proclaiming the gospel on the day of Pentecost, you'll remember he said that Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, dunamis, wonders, teros, and signs, semeion. So you've got all three words. They're wrapped up together in Acts 2:22, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. Now, actually, they're not the only words used for the miraculous in the Bible, but those are the three main words, and I know we're going to have more talks by proper theologians on that, but I just wanted to give you my background and understanding of how we really understand that term miracle. And in a sense, it leads us also to the definition, if you like, for a miracle, which I take to be the signs of God's grace, particular grace in a particular historical context. Because I think it's the historical context as well, which is really so important. And there it is, a sign of God's grace, special grace in a particular historical religious context. And, you know, if you read Richard Dawkins or somebody like that, he'll talk about miracles as sort of random things that seem to just happen out of context. And therefore, we can always explain them in some way or other because, you know, that's what we do. And it's nothing to do with God. And so I think that context really is very important. And it's the way that that comes through strongly in the biblical record. So that's just by way of background, just to introducing what I understand the word miracle to be, at least in its biblical context and so forth. So it's the purpose, it's the context of the miracle, which is really important. Now I want to shift gears a little bit now and come back and just think a bit about the philosopher David Hume. David Hume has been very influential in the secular understanding of miracles and what they are. What I find fascinating and somewhat worrying is that some of his thinking has also been picked up by the church and sort of reproduced within the church context, which I think is really not the direction we should go in. And he wrote this very influential essay called Of Miracles. It's just a 20 pages long. It comes in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, 1748. And it's amazing how the thinking of that little essay, only 20 pages, still comes down to us today and is still quite influential. And I think there are two background points that are important to know if we're going to understand where David Hume is coming from. And the first is that the idea of scientific laws has these very deep theological roots. Actually, the idea of a scientific law is relatively modern. You have to go back to the 17th century to really see the way it was developing, the idea of a scientific law, through the writings of Newton, of course, our Isaac Newton, Descartes, and especially Robert Boyle as well, one of the founders of modern chemistry there based in Oxford, who was a very deeply committed Christian believer. As you know, nearly all the natural philosophers, scientists of the 17th century were deeply committed Christians, and they were the people who really founded the modern disciplines of science that we practice today. And of course, the idea they had about the scientific laws was simply, just as God is a moral lawgiver, therefore they said and thought, therefore there must be scientific laws as well, which are like lost continents that we are discovering, if you like. And once we've discovered it, there is that firm scientific law, which is all part of God's wonderful work in his creation. And so they also, of course, saw miracles as providing strong evidence for Christian faith. It was a strongly evidentialist stream of thought coming there from the natural philosophers of the 17th century. Second point to notice is that the so-called deist thinkers exerted a very strong influence during the 18th century. During the 17th century, you've got this strong Christian natural theology and natural philosophy coming through. Then the 18th century, the deists were gaining influence. And the deists were promoting this kind of rationalistic belief in God, but they kind of resisted the idea of a God who was active in human lives and who answered prayer and who actually acted in the world today and so forth. So they were particularly resistant to the idea of a God who was doing miracles. And so when David came along to write his little essay on miracles in 1748, in a way he's really summarizing the ideas of these deists. So the first part of his essay is summarizing what we call his a priori arguments for the impossibility of miracles. And he's referring to those arguments which Hume thought kind of rule out miracles almost as a matter of principle. And so if you read his essay, and I recommend reading it if you want to do an essay on miracles, it's quite an interesting read. Even now it's got some points to think about. So his opening gambit is to underline the point that, and I quote, experience is our only guide in reasoning concerning matters of fact. That's a key point, experience. However, experience is not an infallible guide, as nature is not always predictable, and neither do we know all the possible ranges of natural causes. Right. Therefore, says Hume, a wise man, I quote here from Hume, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Sounds good, that's fine. So he sort of said the observer should balance the type of evidence which is available to them and then establish a kind of certainty, uncertainty scale in which you sort of measure up believability of things happening according to the amount of evidence which is available. That sounds pretty good. Okay, so far so good. But then we have a problem. So then he goes on to claim that if our experience of something is completely consistent, something already we know about, okay, the apples always fall to the ground, okay, well, they always do. Every time you drop an apple, it falls to the ground. And so in the whole of our lives, we've invariably observed the same sort of joining together of these events. Apple, let it go, joining, falls to the ground, okay, A always causes B. Then if someone observes or claims something different, then we shouldn't believe it, okay? Because, well, it's always been that way, you see, so we shouldn't believe it, however strong the evidence. And so that then brings us to this famous definition of miracles that Hume came up with, and I quote, so he concluded that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Okay, right. Well, that's good for getting an essay going and get people thinking, you see. So in his little essay then, so what's he doing? He's trying to establish that in principle, no testimony under any circumstances would be sufficient to establish the veracity of a miraculous event. And so, according to Hume, natural laws are built on uniformity of experience, and miracles are alleged violations of those natural laws. Therefore, they don't happen. But we notice here something very interesting, you see, that for Hume, a law of nature was something in which our own experience had established a regularity of concurrence between events to such a high degree that not a single occasion had ever been observed which was an exception. And that's actually very different from the Christian idea of laws, which was established in the 17th century, whereby they saw the laws of nature as rooted in God's creative actions. How do we know those things are going to behave the same today, yesterday, as far as we know tomorrow as well? How do we know apples will fall to the ground tomorrow? Because it's part of God's good creation, because of the created order, because there's a God who is in charge of the whole created order. That was the 17th century concept of miracles. So you can see how Hume is moving away from that. But let's just accept his definition of miracles just for a moment, and we'll do a little critique, a little criticism here. And we can notice three main critiques, or more, but let's start with three that philosophers have underlined as being wrong. It's just simply wrong with Hume's argument. First of all, you've already noticed this. I mean, the argument is circular, isn't it? For if you say a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, which have in turn been established by unalterable experience, then clearly there can be no, by prior definition, a priori, no kind of experience that anybody could have unless they were hallucinating that would establish that exception, if you like, to that conclusion that's already there. It's already embedded in the starting point, okay. And the problem, of course, for scientists, I can immediately say, is that that sort of argument, circular argument, leads to a kind of closed mind. Because the whole point about science, we're supposed to have open minds, open to evidence, open to exceptional things happening. And by the way, in science, it's the exceptional things that nobody believes when they first hear it that often will give you your best paper. It'll give you your first author paper in Nature or Science or some top journal, okay? People who want to have exceptions, that's a wonderful thing. Okay, so the second point, the second critique there is the whole, if we're coming now to this point that you get sort of a large accumulation of uniform human experience adds up to the conclusion that this thing will never happen. It's actually not a very useful idea when you start thinking about it. For example, even though nobody has detected intelligent life in space yet, as far as we know, if you had a single unambiguous and intelligent message coming from outer space that clearly established the existence of intelligent life forms elsewhere. Well, there you go. The whole, that changes everything, doesn't it? So one little piece of evidence like that, however consistent your evidence was, your experience was up until that moment, there is no intelligent life elsewhere in space up there. One little bit of evidence, you see, is going to change everything. So as I say, science thrives on exceptions. Conformity, if you like, is a bit boring, really. It's like, okay, you have to have it, okay, but it's not what's going to give you a good scientific career, okay. If you can find something that's really different, that's really exciting. If you want to make an important discovery, look for the exceptions, right? Golden rule in science, if you're going to do science, right? And of course, the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, was famous for making potential falsifiability a kind of key criterion for a key scientific theory. And so he had this famous illustration. He was down in Australia, I think, or went to Australia, hence this illustration. But he said, however many times you observe that there are white swans, you can observe millions and millions and millions of white swans, okay, and then you could come up with a law. All swans are white, you see. Actually, then he went to Australia, and then that woke you up, okay? One black swan, and your whole theory comes crumbling to the ground, okay? There we are. White swans, I don't think, make exactly that noise, but anyway, when people are dozing halfway through the lecture, it's always a good way to wake up. Anyway, but just one single bit of counter-evidence will bring your theory crashing to the ground. And that's a very important point when we're thinking about David Hume. Hume also failed to realize, I think, that the wise and intelligent person bases his or her beliefs on evidence, not on probability. On evidence, not on probability. So evidence is weighed, it's not really added. You're weighing evidence, you see. And evidence for repeatable phenomena is not necessarily greater than for events which happen only once. Just think about the white swans again, and the black swan, and so forth. Okay, the third critique of Hume, which I think is an interesting one also, actually, in fact, he was in a particularly weak position to argue that miracles are impossible because they violate the laws of nature, since for Hume, laws implied no necessity. That's a very important point. See, for Hume, his idea of laws was, if you see two things together, he didn't actually believe in causality. Believe it or not, he didn't really believe in causes. It's just if you see two things happening together all the time, apple, fall to the ground, splat. If you see that happening all the time, the same thing happens, then that will generate your law of nature. That's really not. What's ironic, you see, is most scientists today would take more of the 17th century Christian view of laws as being, if not invalid, then certainly very powerful statements of the conformity of the properties of matter, okay? Hume didn't have that, he didn't have that background, actually. So there's an irony there, which brings some confusion, I think, into his argument. Of course, unfortunately, today scientists often forget the theological roots of where the idea of laws come from, but if they read at all in the history and philosophy of science, they'll soon find that laws, the idea of laws, have deep Christian roots in theology. Right. Now, we need to think also, I think, as we're thinking about this topic of compatibility, you'll see I'm sort of steering around all this background till we come to the crunch answer to the question really this morning. But we need to think, don't we, a little bit about how the Bible understands God as creator, which I know many of you study and know back to front and so forth, but at least you'll see where I'm coming from on this particular question. And I think as we do that, we'll be in a much stronger position to really think about the compatibility question between science and miracles. And of course, what emerges from the biblical thinking about the topic, and indeed from the early church fathers and all the reformers and so forth, is basically God is the author of all that exists. Everything that exists is part of God's created order. If something exists and it's not God, okay, and we're not pantheists, so clearly God is transcendent in relation to his created order. But if it exists, it's part of God's created order. Right. That's a good starting point, I always feel. And I like the terminology or the metaphorical understanding of God as author, because I think it's very powerful. The author writes every word of the book, as I'm reading a book, I don't expect to find gaps in authorship on chapter 3. God is the author of all that exists. It doesn't matter if that's laws of nature, or quantum vacuums, or Higgs bosons, or rabbits, or you, or me, or grass growing outside, or the tree growing, it's all part of God's wonderful created order. And I just keep underlining that as a starting point. And thinking of authorship, I hope you don't mind if I use the illustration here of J.K. Rowling, writing those 7 novels. Do you remember those? Harry Potter, you remember Harry Potter? Anyway, I always remember reading how J.K. Rowling had come up with this sort of idea of these 7 novels about old Harry Potter. And she said, I sat down on my living room floor. She was very poor at the time, actually. And I had all the characters on little pieces of paper all around me on the floor. And there was Harry Potter, and there was Voldemort. And I knew that Voldemort would die. Ooh, not giving away anything here, you see. And there it was on the living room floor. And then as the author, she downloaded her mind into these 7 books from beginning to end. And that to me is a helpful way of thinking about God as creator, that God is the author of creation from beginning to end. And also, as we think about that, and we think about causality, this very causality that David Hume didn't even believe in, I suppose it helps us, we start thinking about the key difference between the way we use creator in human language, the way we create things, we create pots out of existing materials, and the way we think about God's creation and God's existence as the great creator, the mind behind everything that exists. And I like this quote. It's a little bit of heavy-duty theology for, I know, the first session in the morning, but here we go. By Bill Carroll, who's actually the Aquinas fellow over in Oxford. I think he still does that. But I like this quote from Bill Carroll, which really expresses, if you like, expresses Aquinas in language that certainly, as a scientist, I can follow. But he puts it like this, that God's causality is so different from the causality of creatures that there's no competition between the two. That is, we do not need to limit, as it were, God's causality to make room for the causality of creatures. God causes creatures to be causes. I like that. God causes creatures to be causes, something to meditate on, okay. Then he goes on to say, creation is not essentially some distant event, rather it is the ongoing, complete causing of the existence of all that is. At this very moment, with God not causing all that is to exist, there would be nothing at all. Close quote. I like that. And sometimes my secular scientific colleagues say, what difference does it make to you, to your science, if you're a Christian? I say, well, we wouldn't be here. Okay, that's the starting point. Okay, we wouldn't be here, there wouldn't be science, we wouldn't exist, there would be nothing. And they kind of go, oh, okay, that can lead to a discussion, at least, with my secular colleagues. And so creation is about existence, but it's about the meaning, of course, of existence. So speaking of God as creator doesn't entail some alternative mechanism for how things happen. It's not that. It's not about that at all. We can get entangled up in that one. As it were, as Dawkins thinks, it's somehow a sort of competitive, in competition with science. No, that's not how the Bible thinks about creation. Creation is about the author of creation, about how everything exists, and about why it exists. And that, of course, is very, very critical. So, thinking of God as creator, of course, makes us think also about the immanence of God in creation. Clearly, as I say, not part of his creation, but intimately involved in his created order, moment by moment, second by second. And so God's faithfulness is expressed in what we call the gnomic regularity, the law-like regularity of physical things around us. Otherwise, if that wasn't there, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't know where we were. There would be no morality, no existence at all. Without that, it's very fundamental to our own existence. It's what makes our existence possible, isn't it? And this is a Trinitarian immanence. And so right at the beginning there of Genesis, we have this wonderful verse in verse 3, Genesis 1:3, the Spirit of God sweeping over the waters, ready to bring order out of this sort of formless and empty earth, and so on. There we have the theologian Jürgen Moltmann expressing this point, and I quote from him, the divine spirit, the Ruach, is the creative power and the presence of God in his creation. The whole creation is a fabric woven by the Spirit and is therefore a reality to which the Spirit gives form. I like that. I like that. So we have this dunamis already, don't we? Right there at the beginning of Genesis. So the power of God immanent in the created order. And then, of course, in the New Testament, we have a Christological immanence as well. And using one of those most powerful metaphors in the whole, I think, of the New Testament, John tells us in his prologue to the Gospel of John that through the Logos all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And then in Colossians 1, in one of the, I think, the most amazing verses, really, in all of Paul's epistles there we have, in Colossians 1, Paul writes that by the Son of God all things were created, things in heaven, on earth, visible and invisible. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. I often think when Paul's writing this, he wants to get a point across there. If you want to get a point across, all the way through. Okay, everything. He's the author of creation. And so the whole of the created order in all its breadth and diversity carries on existing and being the way it is, and having that gnomic regularity, that law-like behavior, because of this wonderful immanence of the Spirit of God in the created order. Wonderful. And sometimes the immanence of God has been likened to God, if you like, as a composer and creator of a wonderful symphony, where God is conducting the symphony, and all the time there's new things coming along, and he's creating the whole symphony, the music of creation. So what do we scientists do in our research? Well, what we're doing is studying the created order. That's all we can do, isn't it? You know, we have God, the primary cause, if you like, who is the author of everything that exists. We cannot study God, obviously, as scientists, but we can study all those secondary causes whereby God brings about his created order, and where there are exceptions as well. We'll come to those in a moment. We can perhaps have a look at those as well. But we are basically just studying God's creation. Now, isn't it sad that the present secular scientific community often forgets that? But I know that when my active research lab was running, it's now passed on to other people, but I would go in the morning to look at molecular immunology, a topic of some interest to the past couple of years with COVID around, and I would be studying God's wonderful creation. Okay, that's my job as a scientist to do that. I can, you know, so the lab then becomes a place of worship, becomes a sanctuary, it becomes a sacred space where we're investigating and beginning to understand a little bit better God's wonderful created order. And so that's the goal of science, therefore, and is part of a Christian's worship. I love some of these hymns coming out, by the way, which mentioned, you know, the DNA and the protons, and I don't know about Higgs boson, but anyway, some of the wonderful things that are coming in the discoveries of science, and use those as part of our worship. I think that's very, very appropriate indeed. And of course, this undermines also the kind of God of the gaps type of argument, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but you can sort of picture there all of our present scientific knowledge on the left of the screen as like a Swiss cheese, if you like, and it's got many holes. And so those white holes represent the present scientific ignorance that we have. We don't understand many, many, many things in God's created order from a scientific perspective at the moment. And so there's a temptation sometimes by atheists do this. Certainly Richard Dawkins believes this, or believes that this is the rationale for the God he doesn't believe in. But sometimes believers can do this as well, that we put our God, if you like, in the gaps, those little white holes, the present gaps in our scientific knowledge. I think it's not a very good idea, because theologically it's not a good idea, because why should my present ignorance, kind of be an argument for the existence of God? It's also not a good idea because the gaps tend to close up rather quickly or slowly. So certain things we don't understand now, well, if it's about the physical world around us and about the energy and of matter and so forth, the gaps will probably get closed up from a scientific perspective. And so we go back then to Augustine and his great commentary on Genesis, published at the beginning of the 5th century, wasn't it? Beginning of the 5th century, 410 AD, final version, many versions of it. Literal commentary on Genesis, nature is what God does, or what God has done. Augustine says there, in the context of miracles, actually, he's talking about. So, and I think that's a good reminder that the created order, our ignorance should not be any kind of attempted justification for the existence of God, because really God is the author of creation and so forth. And so if nature is what God does, then clearly those miracles that involve an unexpected and unusual event taking place in the created order, like Jesus turning water into wine, they're not at all incompatible with science. They are simply beyond science. They are events that science doesn't have the ability to investigate because they don't happen every Friday. If they happened every Friday, scientists would go along, hey, let's investigate water turning into wine. No, it doesn't happen every Friday. Possibly this is the only time it ever happened in the history of the universe. So science is very good investigating the law-like regularity of the created order. And of course, such miracles, though, as water into wine, simply lie beyond science. They're not part of the ability of science even to investigate those particular events. You could say, in a similar way, that science is not any good at investigating history, because historical events are unique. They only happen once. Okay, it doesn't matter what they are. The history of the Second World War, is science good at that? No, that's history, okay? So I think theologically as Christians we can simply reflect that now and again God chooses to do something differently in the created order as a sign of his special grace in a particular historical context. And, well, John chapter 2, of course, what was the need of the hour, of the wedding feast there in Cana of Galilee? Well, they needed some more wine. Pragmatic, okay? But of course, profoundly and deeply, this was a semeion, wasn't it? As the water turned into wine, this was the inauguration of the new covenant. And so it was both meeting a pragmatic need, practical need of the hour, but also had this profound, deep semeion underlying it. And I think what I find so fascinating as we review the various miracles recorded in Scripture is the great range of the type of miracle that we find there. So all are taras and a dunamis and a semeion, but then how they relate to the physical world around us varies hugely, doesn't it, as we look at the various miracles of the Bible. And so the Bible makes no attempt to sort of distinguish between what we would now call supernatural miracle and a natural miracle. I mean, it's simply all part of God's activity. And this is because in the biblical understanding of creation, God, as I say, is the ultimate and ongoing cause of everything that happens. And it doesn't matter if it's referring, like in Psalm 104, to the sort of daily biological workings of the created order, which is Psalm 104, or whether it's referring to a dramatic event like the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, or Red Sea, which I'm sure Professor Colin Humphreys will be talking more about, no doubt, tomorrow morning for us. So a remarkable event, but again, very different from turning water into wine. So you've got these very different kinds of miracle there. And so Leibniz actually was reflecting on that, the philosopher. He made this point in his famous correspondence with Newton, when he commented that when God does miracles, he does not do it in order to supply the wants of nature, but those of grace. I like that quote from Leibniz. So occasionally, then of course, the text does provide us an explanation, if you like, for how the miracle happens. Again, in Exodus there, as the Israelites come out of Egypt, the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. It specifically makes the point, in answer to prayer, in a particular historical context, yes, a miracle of timing, but there, as I'm sure Colin will be telling us more about tomorrow, it really parts company at this point, you see, the text from David Hume's comment that, quote, nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happens in the common course of nature. No, that's not the way the Bible thinks about it at all. No. The Israelites were trapped. God provided a way out. God's special grace in a particular historical religious context. Compare that then to the turning of water into wine, and it's really different again, isn't it? We think about Christ's resurrection from the dead. Does the Bible give us any explanation about that? No, except for the power of God, who obviously has the power over life and death and raised his Son from the dead as a demonstration of the fulfillment of that wonderful atonement on the cross of his Son for us. So, modern science doesn't add anything to, we all know dead bodies don't rise from the dead. They knew that better in the first century because they were used to handling dead bodies, First century would have to wash and prepare the dead body for burial. You know about dead bodies. Here it's all kind of far away, and something we don't usually touch and have dealings with. So science can add nothing really to what we already read of the New Testament witness from that perspective. So does God perform miracles today? Well, absolutely. I think God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And the unusual nature of the event could be recognized in the same way as we recognize some of those miracles of the Old Testament and the New Testament simply by the miracle of timing, a miracle which is very unusual or something, particular circumstances, special sign of God's grace in a particular circumstance, or it could be really something very unusual where God has just decided in his mercy and grace to do something a bit different. Why not? God can do what he wants. So, if God wants to do something a little bit different, if he wants to create a new cell to give a virgin birth, what's the problem? You see, so that's the way I think about it as a scientist or as a Christian. If you believe in a God who is the author of all creation, then God can write something different in chapter 5 and the second paragraph and the second sentence, Write a new sentence. Why not? Okay, so that's the way I believe. I've got a story there about a Mrs. B, which I won't pause on because I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for question and discussion and, of course, for disagreement if you want. So I guess the question then we come back to is the extent of the language of the miraculous. I mean, sometimes I find personally, just by listening to things, sometimes the language of miracles is used too much for things that I think, well, is that really a miracle and so forth? And we can come a bit tangled up, can't we? And sometimes in the language game here, and what we referred to, and I referred to, well, Thomas Huxley, sorry, I didn't say Thomas Huxley, no, Thomas Mansell there, my great-grandfather being pulled out, saved from, rescued from the jaws of the shark. I put a miracle of grace, question mark. I mean, if somebody comes along and said, no, really, that's an act of God's providence, you shouldn't use the word miracle. I go, fine, that's fine. I don't mind. God is, kind and provident, and he was kind to allow my great-grandfather to live at that particular moment and brought him to faith in Christ through that. That's wonderful. I give praise to the Lord for that. So I don't think we should get, personally, I don't think we should get too tangled up, by making these fine distinctions about the language. But if we just accept, that this is a miracle of timing, and that God had mercy on him, and we think of all that came down from my great-grandfather in terms of many, many other people becoming believers through him, including Thomas Gildot Mansell down the road here, okay? Just a few hundred yards down the road. Well, maybe it is a miracle of grace, but I'm relaxed about the language on that point, I have to say. So, miracles and science, are they compatible? Absolutely. I think providing that we remember the sort of limits of scientific inquiry, providing we remember that miracles are signs of God's special grace in particular historical circumstances, and I think, as I say, providing that we're possibly a little bit cautious about the overuse of the word miracle so that we don't bring the word into disreputation. I think that's important to me. I speak simply as someone who's a scientist, not a theologian. I'll let the theologians sort that out in the next couple of days, okay? No, great question. So, and I ran through that, I know, pretty speedily, but yes, so I was particularly, of course, thinking of human history, and you're absolutely right. There are historical sciences, like the ones you just mentioned, and science is good at those, I think. Science is very good at those, if you like, historical sciences in terms of where data is available and so on. Of course, and even science is good at, the study of the Big Bang. I mean, there's a singularity, if you like, which has only happened once, to the best of our knowledge here, and that's why we have a universe. And science is great at looking at that as far as it can get back. It can only get back, I think, I'm not a physicist, the Planck constant and all that sort of thing. Okay, so yes, that's a real historical study, isn't it? If you think about the study, scientific study of the Big Bang. So I suppose I should have underlined when I was talking about history, I'm thinking of human history really. And I'm thinking of human historical events, in particular, as events where, in a sense, when you walked in through this room, through this door this morning, that was a unique historical event. Now, you could walk through that door again after tea or coffee, or whatever, okay, and I hope you will probably, so, or wherever again, but that would be different. If you think about it, it's not the same historical event. No, it's not. You're different. You will be different after having a tea and coffee. You're not exactly the same. So you start thinking about this, you know, in a sense, everything that happens to us as people is unique, actually. And so, yeah, so in that sense, I was talking about exception, you know, so science is not good at studying that. Of course, they can do sociology and study what people do in crowds and all the rest of it, okay? But if you come down to this unique event, the reasons for the origins of the Second World War, you know, if you come down to that particular event, you know, about human history, then that's more what I was thinking of. So, and when I was talking about exceptionalism in science, just to amplify that point as well a little bit, I was thinking in particular of course, science is good at studying the physical world, the world of physics, the world of materials, the world of energy. It's good at studying that. And where in your experiments, your experimental data or your observations, there are observations or experiments that don't fit very well with what you expected, that's what's interesting, okay? That's what's publishable, you hope, okay? And sometimes it turns out to be an artifact or something that can't be repeated, which is very disappointing, actually, but there you go, that's science. And so that's what I was really referring to in terms of exceptionalism, I suppose. So thank you for picking up that point for clarification. I mean, if I'm a scientist and there's a lady as part of a congregation and who's got severe rheumatoid arthritis and has been in deep pain for many, many years, you probably have people like that in your congregation. You know, it's not uncommon. And she's seen 5 specialists and they've been helping her a little bit, but not really. But all her medical records are sound. The church is praying for healing. And then one day she's healed completely. I mean, completely healed. And she's tracked for the next 5, 10 years and so on. And he never comes back. He never comes back. And so there's all the evidence. And so as a scientist, I'm giving this example really for how a scientist thinks about evidence. And the scientist has to go, I think I would call that a miracle. I personally would have no hesitation at all, because there's a historical context. I mean, that she's been prayed for. It's not a random event. And certainly as you well know, out of medicine, you can get unexpected reversals. You can get people who go into remission who've got cancer. You can, all kinds of things. Sometimes exceptional things happen. I wouldn't necessarily call them a miracle. There was no prayer for that person. It wasn't a context. There wasn't a context of prayer and concern for that particular lady at that particular moment. So, and then you could ask the question, well, is it possible that we would have the ability to describe Mrs. B's healing in biological terms, biomedical terms? And I would go, in principle, yes, I don't see why not. But in practical terms, no, because we weren't there. That was a unique event for her. So that would be really hard, actually, to do. But I don't see why not. In principle, you could track exactly in the biology, you could actually do it in principle had you been there at the moment. And to me, that makes no difference at all to the miraculous nature of the event, because God has healed that person in answer to prayer in a particular history. That's the way I would think about that, I think. So, yeah. I know it gets complicated. I know there are experts here on this area, which I'm not an expert on at all. And, I have my own particular experience of God's deliverance, not from healing at that moment, but, why I felt particular, I wouldn't even call it a miracle necessarily, but deliverance, out of certain situations, which I would say, somebody wanted to call it a miracle, I wouldn't mind, okay? But, God's grace in a particular historical circumstance where I was praying. This is in West Beirut during a civil war with bombs coming down, so, I can tell you stories about that, which I won't at the moment, but, okay, yeah, so, thank you. I don't know if that begins to get that question, but thank you. I would say down to God's will. I mean, I don't think science can give you any explanation at all. Now, of course, yeah, I mean, science could, you know, the medics could study, you know, have an investigation of those people and give their view about how long you got to live and so forth and all that kind of thing. But, you know, I don't know if people remember had David Watson, you know, what great evangelist, Anglican evangelist from a previous era, wonderful with students and so on. And, wow, there's so many people praying, you know, and he believed in a God of healing. So many people prayed for David Watson, actually, and yeah, the Lord took him, you know, he wasn't healed, okay, the Lord took him. I just think, well, you know, God's got another plan, you know, God has different plans for different people, actually, and I'll tell you, I mean, this is not quite spot on that topic, but when I was working in the Middle East, you know, I was working with OM, we had OM teams all around the Middle East, and you know, we had some people got killed, and maybe I shouldn't say this because I'm online, but anyway, you know, when you're in the midst of a war or a difficult situation, you can have some humor which maybe doesn't sound like humor, you know, in this part of the world when you're not in a war right now, anyway. But we always said, you know, God seems to take the holy people, you know, the real people who are following the Lord more closely first, you know. And they were wonderful Christians, you know, and the Lord took them. So we almost had a sort of joke in inverted commas, okay, you understand, that we better not get too holy, the Lord will take us now, you know. So it really seemed like that, okay, you know. So I could tell you stories which I won't, you know, don't have time, but yeah, so I've, you know, the Lord, it's up to him, you know. He'll heal somebody now, and praise the Lord, give him another 10 years on earth to serve the Lord. Wonderful, great, amen. Another person, you know, who's got the same thing, he's also got pancreatic cancer, you know, and poof, the Lord takes him, you know. So, yeah, we don't know, do we? I mean, maybe the Lord will tell us when we get to glory, maybe. Maybe not, I don't know, but I'm sort of looking forward to hearing that. Why did you take him then? Okay. But we certainly don't know, do we, in this life? But I think, so we pray by faith and we trust the Lord to work out his purposes according to his plan. I think that's what we do, isn't it, really?